For this session, we're going to talk about how to give and receive feedback. As you go along, think about how you might teach these feedback skills to your student team. References for this information will be provided at the end of the presentation. So what makes feedback such an important topic for leading a student team? First, it allows us to add our perspective to the students' self-assessments. And second, feedback coupled with practice helps students learn skills faster. So feedback enhances our learning outcomes. So in this session, we'll talk about several key aspects of the feedback process. First, how should we prepare for our feedback sessions? Second, what methods work best when giving feedback? And finally, how can we improve our ability to receive feedback? So let's start by discussing how we can effectively prepare to give feedback. The literature provides some excellent recommendations that will help us make our feedback more meaningful. First, in our orientation, we can help students understand how they should react to feedback, such as avoiding defensiveness, looking past their emotions, and objectively listening. We should also agree on learning goals and use these to reinforce the value of our feedback. Next, we need to be intentional with our observations. We should be mindful of which specific behaviors we want to praise and which ones might need improvement. It's helpful to schedule dedicated time for student observation so that you can watch for these behavioral trends. Finally, preparation of the actual time and place of giving feedback is important. Schedule enough time for meaningful discussions, make sure the location is private so you won't be interrupted, and set it up so that you can all be physically comfortable during the feedback session. So, as you prepare to have a feedback session with your students, use your orientation to establish your expectations and students' learning goals. Take time to be mindful during your observations, and make sure that the feedback environment is quiet, private, and comfortable. Now we'll move on to tips and techniques for actually giving feedback. Here are the topics that we'll discuss: choosing an appropriate method for providing feedback, how to start the session, what to consider during the session, and how to effectively end a feedback session. There are a lot of ways to provide feedback, but we'll discuss just a few of the more common ones: the feedback sandwich, the ask, tell, ask method, the Pendleton method, and the 1-minute preceptor. What you choose will depend on your personality, your situation, and your purpose. Most of us have heard of the feedback sandwich, where you give positive, then constructive, then positive feedback. While this is easier to receive, it can also come off as insincere. Also, it can dilute or obscure the constructive feedback, confusing the learner. So there may be better options. The ask, tell, ask method is one such option. In this method, you first ask the student for their own assessment of their performance. Then, you share any additional observations that you've made, and then work together to develop a mutually agreed upon plan to improve behaviors. The Pendleton method is very similar to ask, tell, ask. It starts with the student's self-assessment, followed by positive observations and then negative observations, and finally a discussion on areas for improvement. In both methods, starting with the student's own assessment is the key. The 1-minute preceptor method starts with the student making a clinical decision. Then the CI asks probing questions to uncover the student's rationale. The student then answers questions and provides evidence for their choice, and the CI wraps up with a teaching moment. This method is a quick way to assess knowledge and provide specific feedback. It's been used extensively in the training of doctors, and it could be an effective way to help your students learn how to quickly apply evidence-based practice in their patient care. And that's all the time we have for choosing methods. Take a moment to reflect on how you could use one or more of these methods in your own practice with students. Once again, a key component to effective feedback is starting with the student's self-assessment. Once you've prepared yourself and the environment and chosen an appropriate way to deliver your feedback, You're now ready to start your feedback session. Here are a couple of evidence-based suggestions on how to do it right. First, schedule a time to provide feedback to each student individually and to both students as a group. This way, you can provide the confidential, private feedback that all students need while holding them accountable for their group goals and collaborative learning. Make sure you start the session as soon after your observation as possible, but still give time for any heightened emotions to cool. Also, be sure to explicitly state that you're giving feedback. If it's not labeled as feedback, some students might think it's just idle chit-chat. Once you've successfully started your feedback session, it's time to start considering what you'll say, how you'll say it, and how you'll approach sensitive topics. In other words, consider and plan your behaviors during the session. First, your students are watching you to learn how to be a professional, so try to be a role model for consideration and respect. Also, try not to barrage your students with a long list of deficiencies. They'll only be able to process the first one or two, so limit and prioritize your critical feedback. Next, try not to make it personal. Keep the focus on the behaviors that you want to improve rather than on the person. If you can do this objectively without bringing any emotion into it, the student will be much more receptive to your suggestions and they may come up with ideas for improvement on their own. After having a respectful, objective, and collaborative feedback session, you're ready to wrap it up and get back to work. There are just a couple of key components to consider at the end of your session to make sure that your feedback is meaningful and that it gets applied effectively. A good feedback session should include an opportunity for your students to give you feedback. This promotes openness, improves communication, and gives you a chance to model how you want them to receive feedback. It also helps the students feel that their input matters. Finally, make sure your recommendations stick by collaboratively making a plan for how to apply the feedback. Help your students come up with meaningful, measurable ways to show that they're changing their clinical behaviors in a positive direction. So, to recap, when giving feedback, choose the best method for your situation, set expectations early, be clear and objective in your observations, and always end by setting an action plan so that your students know how to apply what they've learned. Our last topic on feedback is how to receive it graciously. The literature provides some sound principles that can help ensure that our feedback isn't falling on deaf ears. As we discuss these principles, do a little self-assessment to see if you're a good role model in this area. First, when someone gives us feedback, we need to be open to it. This will be evident if we're consistently asking for honest feedback on our performance. Our openness will also be readily apparent if we listen attentively to the giver of the feedback. Another principle for receiving feedback is sincerity. If we sincerely want feedback, we'll ask questions to make sure we understand the guidance being given. We'll also show gratitude to the person for doing the hard thing and sharing their thoughts with us on how to improve. And finally, if we're sincerely grateful for the feedback, we'll share how we plan to apply the giver's suggestions. This will show that we're taking it seriously and that we really did want to know how we could improve. So here are a few parting reminders for giving and receiving feedback. Observe your students' performance mindfully, prepare for feedback thoughtfully, be objective and fair, be clear about goals and objectives, and keep the communication lines open for feedback. Feedback is an essential part of how we learn and develop, both personally and professionally. It will only have the effect we want if it's delivered in a way that students can receive it positively and apply it safely. Thanks for listening. Here are the references that we used to create this feedback presentation. There are many more suggestions and tips than we shared here, so we encourage you to explore these sources on your own.